Hi everyone, my name is Kylie Saksic and I will be presenting on chapter 1, which is preference and indifference curves. So I have a set of objectives for us, which is learn the 3 fundamental assumptions about preferences, define and draw an indifference curve, relate the properties of the indifferent curves to assumptions about preference, define marginal rate of substitution, and our fifth one, indifference curves to illustrate perfect complement and perfect substitutes. So, what exactly are the 3 fundamental assumptions about preference? That is completeness, transitivity, and more is better. So, for completeness, we say preferences are complete when a consumer can always say one of the following about 2 bundles. A is preferred to B, B is preferred to A, or A is equally good as B. So a more detailed example could be if chewing gum is preferred to mints, mint is preferred to chewing gum, then they are both equally as good. So now for transitivity, we say preferences are transitive if they are internally consistent. So if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then it must be that A is preferred to C. So if chewing gum is preferred to mints and mints is preferred to lollipops, then it must mean that chewing gum is preferred to the lollipops. And for our third one, more is better, it is if bundle A represents more of at least one good and no less of any other good than bundle B, then A is preferred to B. So if bundle A, being the chewing gum, has more by at least one good and no less than any other good than bundle B, which could be mints, then A is preferred to B. So the chewing gum is preferred to the mints. Now, moving on, what is an indifference curve? Well, an indifference curve is a graph of all combination of bundles that a consumer prefers equally. So that could be bundle A, B, C. It could have many. So now that we know what an indifference curve is, we need to learn how to draw it. So now when we create an indifference curve, we will need to identify the bundles that the consumer is indifferent about consuming. So which they might prefer. So if in the bundle the consumer has more apples, then they will have less bananas, and vice versa. It is also important to note as well that once we do find all of these bundles, we will then connect the points by drawing a line, and that line will represent our indifference curve, which will then also show us the consumer satisfaction, as seen in our last slide. So now the 3 properties of the indifferent curve includes they are downward sloping, they do not cross, and they are bowed in. So keep in mind that more is better implies indifference curves are downward sloping. Transitivity and more is better imply indifference curves do not cross. And preference for variety implies that indifference curves are bowed in. But B has more of both bananas and apples than does A. And more is better implies indifference curves are downward sloping. And this first graph, violates that. Now, if we look to our right, which is the second graph, you can see that the indifference curves crossing, but that is not correct. When they cross, it leads to contradictory preferences. It is suggesting that consumer can simultaneously prefer one bundle over another and yet be indifferent between the same two bundles. And the bundles cannot be preferred at the same time. And that violates our assumption of transitivity and more is better. And now going back to our third point, which was they are both in, it is basically saying that because it shows different preferences and trade-offs, for example, the consumer might want more apples and bananas today, but tomorrow they'll want more bananas than apples. And when graphing these preferences, we would naturally get a bowed in indifference curve, as we can see in our very first indifference curve from the beginning of the presentation. So now, moving on to the marginal rate of substitution, which can be noted as MRS. This is the number of units of one good a consumer is willing to give up to get one more unit of another good and maintain the same level of satisfaction. And the mathematical equation for the MRS is change in A divided by change in B. So this could be change in apples divided by change in bananas. And I furthered the example a little bit more and I added in some numbers. So the change in apples being -2 and change in bananas being 1. And that is equal to -2. And the MRS is negative because it represents a trade-off. So this means more apples for fewer bananas. So now, perfect complements and perfect substitutes. So keep in mind that the model of a consumer behavior is completeness, transitivity, more is better, and love is variety. But now, there are two other types of preference relations, and that is perfect complements and perfect substitutes. So an example would be earbuds and iPods. You don't have to have 2 earbuds if you only have 1 iPod, or 2 iPods if you only have 1 earbuds. It just wouldn't make sense because you don't need it. Or, for example, another example could be a TV and remote control. You only need 1 TV instead of having 2 remote controls. Like, you only need 1 for 1. 2 remote controls for your 1 TV won't make any sense. And 2 TVs for your 1 remote control, it just doesn't make sense. And this is how it is graphed using the indifference curve. And then now we have our substitute goods. And substitute goods is when you don't have the good you usually get, so you get another one. Or a good that you don't mind exchanging and it's easily, like, readily available to have multiple. So in this one I have the Great Value milk and the Borden milk. And in this we have, so 5 cups of the Great Value milk is the same as 5 cups of the Borden milk. So if you're making a cake and you just so happen to need 5 cups of milk, it wouldn't really matter. It could help you guys. So, thank you.